Hello, my friends, and welcome to the USS Constellation. In the inner harbor of Baltimore, the Constellation was commissioned in 1855 and remained in active service until 1955. She was originally built to run down slave trade ships. So in 1807, the British outlawed the slave trade within the British Empire, but they only had jurisdiction over British ships and ships of British colonies. And as a matter of fact, we fought a whole war, the War of 1812, over not allowing the British to enter American ships. And so when the Amistad controversy happened in, I believe, 1842, it showed the lack of enforcement ability of American ships to patrol their own. And so the Constellation was part of a group of ships that was commissioned in order to chase down the illegal slave trade. Now, she wasn't decommissioned until 1955, and so there is a very long history of the Constellation following her original purpose of running down the trade in enslaved people. And so during the Civil War, she was chasing down blockade runners and served up through the Second World War, where she acted as a flagship, where basically a commander would live on the Constellation in order to free up a little more room on the actual warships that were involved in the day-to-day combat in World War II. And here we have the belaying pins. And I find it fascinating how these work, because you can see if you just pull that belaying pin out from the middle rope, the rope just becomes loose, and suddenly whatever it was holding on to is loose. And so it's a very quick way of releasing a knot. It could also make an excellent club. But the USS Constellation, as I said, saw service in the American Civil War, maintaining the blockade of southern ports, as well as patrolling the Atlantic Ocean for blockade runners. And here we are on the gun deck. And I just think it's fascinating how cannon worked on board ship. And I'm going to take a closer look in here. If you look at the ropes and the way that the cannon are attached to the hull, basically they're on wheels. And so when you fire a cannon, it thrusts back, but the ropes absorb a lot of that strain. And so you're not weakening your own hull with every strike of the cannon. And here, of course, are the instruments of how to load a cannon and tamp down the powder. But again, this system of ropes and wheels has always fascinated me as the inner workings of a shipboard cannon. Because again, if you attach the cannon to the deck, every time you fire that cannon, you're going to hurt your ship. But the fact that those ropes would allow the cannon to fire backward and then catch the thrust would prevent damage. And here we have the galley on our way to the coolest part of the ship, in my opinion, definitely the most luxurious. This is the captain's cabin. This entire part of the ship, this is the very front of the ship, by the way. This is the captain's cabin, where he could entertain both his officers and, of course, in port, any local dignitaries to spread goodwill. And this is his stateroom. This is the captain's quarters, where he would sleep. And, of course, it has an amazing view, not least because the inner harbor of Baltimore is gorgeous. I am a fan. Ever since in 1992, my high school choir went on a field trip to Baltimore, and we went on an inner harbor cruise, and I've been somewhat obsessed ever since. This, of course, is a private privy and a washroom. Now, the captain's cabin has actually two private washrooms, whereas the officers and the crew shared the entirety of the head. And it's called the head because on this ship and in the ships of this sort, it is located at the head of the ship, at the bow, which I found out touring this ship. And here we have the captain's office, but it was also convertible to a stateroom. So if the captain took on board a passenger of high status, for example, this is where they would sleep. That office would be converted. It would a bed would be added, and it would be a mirror image of the captain's cabin. This is the captain's pantry because captains were usually men of means, and they were allowed to purchase their own provisions. Now we're going to go down to the next deck. And here we have where the crew would sleep. Now, this is kind of an interesting case because in normal operations of the ship, the hammocks would not be strung up. The sailors were given 7 minutes to pack up their hammock and stow it on the deck of the ship. And here is the sick bay. And it's a fascinating look of, it's kind of a halfway between a bed and a hammock where the sick crew members would be treated. And you just see the architecture of this ship, and it just astounds me at how beautifully it all comes together. And of course, you have the surgical instruments of the time. But the 7 minutes was how long a sailor was given in order to wake up. They took down their hammock from the deck above, and then they brought it up onto the main deck where they would stash it in the railings of the ship. And for one, it got it out of the way, but it also, if the ship was in combat, meant that you could absorb more enemy fire because it would be shooting at the hammocks. And these are the staterooms and offices of the various ship's officers. That particular one was the pharmacy. But here we have, and we'll see more detail in a moment, but here we have some currently closed to the public staterooms where you would basically have a bed and a desk. As I mentioned, we will be seeing that in a second with these staterooms that are open. So if your adventuring party in Dungeons & Dragons is commissioning a room on board a ship, this is probably what they're getting. Unless they're really rich, in which they're getting the stateroom with the captain. And yes, every time I go to any place historically, any place that has historical significance, I am indeed thinking about how my D&D adventuring party relates to it. But again, here we have the officers' quarters. And all of these little rooms, they're almost cubicles, are of a similar design where you have a desk for the work to be done and a bed. There's not a terrible amount of space, but you do have a tiny little bit of privacy, which, of course, on board ship is an extremely valuable commodity. Now, this last one I really enjoy. This is the lowest status because it's kind of a cramped quarter, but the way that the bed just fits in with the sweep of the stern of the boat just delights me for some reason. And then again, on the other side, on the other wall, we have a similar, basically mirror image of what I just showed. And here we are downstairs in the hold. I had to get on my knees to take this shot. That roof is extremely low. But going from the area of personal cargo down to the cargo hold of the ship, and if you look down, you will notice there are ballast stones. And one of the things that I found fascinating about Savannah, Georgia, is that the entire old town is paved in these ballast stones because the ships would come across the ocean ballasted and pick up cargo. In the case of Savannah, Georgia, it would be cotton for the most part. And then the cargo would act as ballast to the ship, and they had to get rid of these ballast stones, but they would use them to pave the streets. So the ships would unload their ballast. The local town, I don't know if they would buy them or they would just collect them, and over time they paved their entire old city using these ballast stones. Here in Fells Point in Inner Harbor, Baltimore, there are historic paving stones, but they don't look to be the right size for ballast stones, so I don't believe that is the case. Thank you very much for joining me.